She was the richest girl in the world. Not rich in the way we casually throw that word around. Not $1 million trust fund. Not a family beach house and a stock portfolio. We are talking about a fortune equivalent to nearly $1 billion in today's money, handed to her on her 21st birthday. With a bow on it, she owned palaces, plural, on 3 different continents. She had a mansion in London's Regent's Park, a Japanese palace she built from scratch in Mexico, a riad in the medieval city of Tangier, Morocco. She wore Russian imperial jewels that had once belonged to the Romanovs. She dined with kings, danced with the most celebrated actor in Hollywood, and had her photograph on the front page of newspapers across the world. For 40 years, the press followed her everywhere she went. Every gown, every jewel, every husband. And there were 7 of those. 7 husbands. 2 princes, 1 count, 1 baron, 1 international playboy, 1 Hollywood legend, and 1 man whose royal title she literally purchased for him. The world called her the poor little rich girl. They said it like it was a punchline, like her life was one long cautionary tale about what happens when you give too much money to the wrong person. But here's what they never told you. When Barbara Hutton died in 1979 alone, nearly blind, bedridden in a hotel penthouse, the only thing left in her bank account was $3,500. Not $3 million, not $300,000, $3,500. Gone, all of it. One of the largest personal fortunes in American history, reduced to an amount that would not cover 2 months' rent in the city where she was born. And the question that has haunted historians, biographers, and everyone who has ever heard this story is the same question we are going to answer tonight. Where did it go? And who took it? Because here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. This was not a story of a reckless woman who did not know the value of money. This was a story of a child who never stood a chance. A woman who was failed by every single person who was supposed to protect her. And a world that was more interested in watching her fall than in asking why she was falling. This is the full truth about Barbara Hutton. And it starts not in a palace, but in a hotel room. With a 4-year-old girl and a body on the floor. But before we go into that, if stories like this matter to you, stories about women history got wrong, women whose full truth was never told, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week on Behind the Pearls, we open the locket on a woman the world reduced to a footnote. You do not want to miss what's coming. Now, back to Barbara. To understand what Barbara lost, you have to understand what built it. Because this was not inherited aristocracy. This was not old European blood money passed down through centuries of privilege. This was something very specifically American. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born in 1852 on a farm in upstate New York. He had almost nothing. No connections, no education beyond the basics, and no particular advantages. What he had was a single idea, and that idea was so simple, it seems almost embarrassing in hindsight. What if everything in the store cost the same price? What if the price was so low that even the poorest working family in America could afford to walk in and buy something? The 5 and dime store. A fixed low price for everything. Simple goods, clearly labeled, no negotiating, no credit, no fuss. It sounds ordinary now because Frank Woolworth made it ordinary. Before him, shopping was a transaction you had to be educated to navigate. He changed that. By 1913, there were more than 1,000 Woolworth stores stretching from New York to San Francisco and across the Atlantic into Britain. He built the Woolworth Building in Manhattan, for a brief time the tallest building in the world, and paid for its entire construction in cash. In cash, $65 million, the equivalent of over $1 billion today. When Frank died in April 1919 from a tooth infection, because he had an irrational terror of dentists and refused to see one until it was too late, he left everything to his wife, Jenny. There was one small, catastrophic problem. He died before signing his will. The fortune passed to Jenny under the law, but Jenny was already suffering from what the family quietly described as mental incompetence. She was largely unable to manage her own affairs. When Jenny died in 1924, her share of the estate, $26 million, passed to her granddaughter Barbara, who was 12 years old. 12 years old. $26 million. No mother, no father who was present, and no one in the world who was looking out for her. By the time Barbara turned 21 in November 1933, her fortune had grown further. Her father, Franklin Hutton, co-founder of the E.F. Hutton investment firm, a man who was brilliant with other people's money and completely absent as a parent, had managed her trusts and increased the total inheritance to $42 million. Add in money from her mother's separate estate, and the figure crossed $50 million. $50 million in 1933. We are talking about $800 to $900 million in today's money. The newspapers went wild. Her face was on front pages across the country. Editorials debated the morality of such a concentration of wealth in the hands of one young woman during the depths of the Great Depression. Millions of Americans were standing in bread lines, and Barbara Hutton had just become one of the wealthiest people on earth. She had also been shaped, since before she could form complete sentences, by a wound so deep that all the money in the world was never going to be enough to heal it. Edna Woolworth was Frank's second daughter. She was beautiful, sensitive, and deeply unhappy in the way that beautiful, sensitive women were frequently allowed to be unhappy in the early 20th century quietly, without help, without diagnosis, without anyone taking it seriously. She had married Franklin Hutton, a stockbroker and associate of her father's. On paper, it was a good match. In reality, Franklin was a serial philanderer with little interest in domestic life and even less interest in the emotional needs of his wife. He had affairs openly. He was absent constantly. Edna, left alone in their suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York, while her husband moved through the world as if she barely existed, unraveled. She was 33 years old. She had a 4-year-old daughter she adored. And she was completely, invisibly drowning. On May 2nd, 1917, Edna Hutton died in her suite at the Plaza Hotel. The official cause listed was mastoiditis, an infection of the air cells behind the ear. The coroner decided no autopsy was necessary. The case was closed. But the rumors never went away. Biographer C. David Heyman, who conducted extensive interviews for his definitive account of Barbara's life, documented persistent and widely held belief within the family's circle that Edna had poisoned herself, that she had read yet another letter confirming yet another one of Franklin's affairs, put on her finest lace dress, sat down by the window of her suite, and made a choice. According to Heyman, it was also widely believed that the Woolworth family paid off city officials to avoid an investigation and suppress a scandal. We will never know for certain what happened in that suite. What we know is what happened next. The person who found Edna's body was not a nurse, not a hotel maid, not Franklin Hutton, who was almost certainly not there. It was 4-year-old Barbara. Think about that for a moment. Not as a biographical detail, as a human experience. She was 4 years old. She had no framework for what death was, no ability to process what she was seeing. No one had prepared her for this because no one had prepared themselves. What that moment does to a child, what it etches into the part of the brain that processes safety and love and attachment, is not something that money can fix. It is not something that boarding schools can fix, or governesses, or being taken in by wealthy relatives. It becomes the lens through which everything else is seen. After Edna's death, Franklin Hutton did what Franklin Hutton had always done. He left. He handed Barbara to relatives and nurses and got on with his life. She lived for a time with her aunt, Marjorie Merriweather, post the serial heiress, a genuinely warm woman who tried to provide some stability. But she was not Barbara's mother, and Barbara knew it. She was enrolled in a series of boarding schools: Miss Shin's School for Girls in Los Angeles, the Santa Barbara School for Girls, eventually Miss Porter's School in Connecticut, one of the most prestigious girls' schools in America. She was well educated, impeccably presented, and profoundly, silently alone. She grew up learning that the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally either disappeared or were paid to be there. That is not a small thing to carry into adulthood. That is a life sentence. In November 1930, Barbara Hutton was 18 years old, and it was time, by the customs of her social class, for her formal introduction to society. Her debutante ball. It was held at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. The guest list read like a directory of old money. The decorations were elaborate. The band played. The champagne flowed. The reported cost was over $60,000. It was November 1930. 18 months into the Great Depression, while millions of Americans stood in breadlines outside. Photographs of Barbara in her white gown and diamond earrings were printed on front pages across the country the next morning. The public reaction was not admiration. It was fury. Letters poured into newspapers. Editorials condemned the extravagance. Radio commentators used Barbara as a symbol of everything wrong with inherited wealth. And someone gave her the nickname that would follow her until the day she died: the poor little rich girl. She was 18 years old. She had spent her entire childhood in grief and loneliness. She had not planned her own debutante ball that had been arranged by adults around her. And now the entire country hated her for it. That nickname followed her for 49 years. It followed her into every marriage, every newspaper column, every public appearance. It was always meant as a joke. But if you look at the photographs from that night, really look at Barbara's face, past the diamonds and the white dress, there is something in her eyes that looks very much like a girl who already knows the punchline is not funny. 2 princes, 1 count, 1 baron, 1 Hollywood legend, 1 international playboy, and 1 man whose royal title she bought him as a wedding gift. 7 husbands in 40 years. The world saw these marriages as evidence of recklessness, as entertainment, as material for gossip columns and eventually made for TV movies. What they actually were was something far sadder: the same desperate search, made 7 times, by a woman who never stopped believing that the next one might be different. Let's go through them, one by one, because each husband is a chapter in how one of the greatest fortunes in American history was systematically dismantled, and how a woman who should have been protected was instead consumed. His name was Alexis Mdivani, and he called himself a Georgian prince. The Georgian referred to the country, not the American state, and the prince was a title of disputed legitimacy that he wore with complete conviction. He was dark, charming, and had already married one American heiress before Barbara. He understood the mechanics of the wealthy American woman who longed for European nobility. He understood it like a craftsman understands his tools. They married in Paris on June 22, 1933. Barbara was 20 years old. She was also, for the first time in her life, in control of her own money. And Alexis was already spending it. He bought cars. He bought clothes. He bought jewels not for Barbara, but for the women he was sleeping with behind her back. He gave lavish gifts to other men in his circle. He treated her fortune like a personal expense account, with no limit and no accountability. The marriage lasted 2 years. By 1935, it was over. Barbara had entered her first marriage hoping, at last, for the kind of love that felt like safety. What she got was an education in how quickly someone could drain you if you let them. She would not learn the lesson fast enough. If Alexis M. Devani was a pickpocket, Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow was something far darker. He was a Danish Count Tall, physically imposing, cold in the way that men who are described as disciplined often turn out to be. By multiple accounts from people who knew Barbara during this period, Reventlow was physically and psychologically abusive. It was during this marriage that Barbara developed the anorexia nervosa that would ravage her body for the remaining 40 years of her life. It is not a coincidence that an eating disorder rooted in control emerged during a marriage defined by its complete absence of it. But Reventlow was not merely brutal. He was strategic. In 1937, he persuaded Barbara to renounce her American citizenship. The official reason given was to protect her fortune from U.S. inheritance taxes. What biographers have documented is that his actual concern was eliminating the U.S. government's claim on her estate in the event of her death, leaving it fully available to a foreign national husband. She signed the papers. She became stateless. The decision drew international outrage and complicated her legal and financial affairs for years. They had one child together, a son, Lance, born in 1936, and when the marriage fell apart, Reventlow launched a bitter, prolonged custody battle that played out in courtrooms across 2 continents. He used Lance as a weapon. He used the press as a weapon. He used everything he could find. Barbara eventually won custody, but the victory cost her enormously, financially, emotionally, and physically. She emerged from this marriage thinner, more medicated, and more convinced than ever that love was something that had to be survived. And then came Cary Grant. If you are going to understand Barbara Hutton's story, you have to understand what Cary Grant meant in 1942. He was not simply a handsome actor. He was the most desired man in Hollywood. He walked into rooms and the entire energy changed. Women straightened up. Men straightened their ties. He was charm made physical. They had met on an ocean crossing from New York to England in 1939. And by most accounts, it was genuine. Grant was drawn to Barbara not to her money, but to something in her that he recognized. A certain quality of sadness beneath the performance of glamour. He had his own complicated childhood. He understood what it meant to construct a public self from the ruins of a private one. They married on July 8, 1942. The press immediately nicknamed them Cash and Cary, a derisive play on Grant's name and Barbara's fortune. Grant was furious about this for the rest of his life. He had, in fact, signed a prenuptial agreement refusing any financial settlement in the event of divorce. He wanted nothing from her money. He wanted, by all accounts, her. Cary Grant was probably the only one of Barbara's 7 husbands who did not want her for what she had. He wanted her for who she was. And who she was, by 1942, was a woman in serious trouble. She was deeply addicted to prescription tranquilizers and sleeping pills. She barely ate. She spent days in bed. Grant, tried friends of the couple, recalled him coaxing her to eat, sitting with her through bad nights, trying to pull her back from the edge of herself. But Grant was also one of the most in-demand actors in Hollywood. Film after film, long absences. And every absence reopened something in Barbara that had first cracked open in a Plaza Hotel suite in 1917. They divorced in 1945. Grant later said the trouble was not her. People just cannot disassociate her from her money, and they act like idiots around her. They remained close friends until Barbara's death. He attended her funeral. He was one of approximately 10 people who did. The marriage to Cary Grant was not a cautionary tale. It was the closest Barbara Hutton ever came to something real. And it still was not enough. That is perhaps the most heartbreaking detail in this entire story. After Grant, there was a brief pause. Barbara was 34. Tired in ways that photographs from this period make impossible to miss. But the silence never lasted long. With her silence, had too much room for the things she was trying not to feel. In 1947, she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Lithuanian-Russian nobleman and racing car driver, whose aristocratic title came with very little actual money. That gap between title and funds, Barbara was becoming well-practiced at bridging. Trubetskoy spent freely, treated her as a social accessory, and departed 4 years later with a divorce settlement reportedly in the millions. What is worth noting here is not the details of the marriage itself, but what was happening to Barbara's body. By the late 1940s, she was visibly, worryingly thin. The anorexia had settled into a permanent pattern. She ate almost nothing. She drank too much. She took pills to sleep and pills to wake up. Nobody around her seemed to treat this as a medical emergency. It was simply Barbara, simply how she was. The frailty was almost aestheticized by those around her. Part of the image, another detail in the portrait. And now we arrive at the marriage that made the whole world laugh. Except it was not funny at all. Porfirio Rubirosa was, without exaggeration, the most notorious playboy of the 20th century. A Dominican diplomat, polo champion, and racing car driver, he had already married tobacco heiress Doris Duke, Barbara's closest rival in terms of personal wealth, and extracted a significant fortune from that marriage before moving on. He was, at the time he began courting Barbara, openly and actively having an affair with actress Zaza Gabor. He made no real effort to hide it. Barbara, at 41, was lonely, medicated, and desperate for attention from someone who seemed exciting and fully alive. Rubirosa was nothing if not alive. They married on December 30th, 1953. The marriage lasted 53 days. From December 30th, 1953 to February 20th, 1954, 53 days. In that time, Rubirosa received from Barbara approximately $2.5 million in cash, a 1930s Degas painting, a converted B-25 bomber aircraft, a string of polo ponies, additional jewels and gifts whose total value historians have estimated at over $1 million more. Total extraction in 53 days, somewhere between $3 and $4 million. He left. He went back to Zaza Gabor. The press reported it as a comedy. Jokes were made, cartoons were drawn. Barbara was 41 years old, publicly humiliated on an international scale, $4 million poorer, and alone in a hotel room. She reached for her pills. She always reached for her pills. The sixth marriage was quieter. different in a way that made it stand out from the others. Baron Gottfried von Krom was a German tennis player of genuine distinction, a two-time Wimbledon finalist in the 1930s, widely considered one of the finest players of his generation. But his story was complicated by history in ways that gave him a depth the other husbands largely lacked. Von Kram had refused to endorse the Nazi regime during the 1930s, at enormous personal risk. He was subsequently imprisoned by the Gestapo on charges that historians have largely interpreted as politically motivated. He was a man who had stood for something at a time when it cost him everything. Barbara had known him for years, and perhaps something in her was drawn to the idea of a man with principles, a man who had already demonstrated, in the most serious arena imaginable, that he was not simply for sale. The marriage lasted from 1955 to 1959. It ended without the dramatic public explosions that had characterized the others. Von Kram did not drain her in the way the others had. He died in a car accident near Cairo in 1976, 3 years before Barbara. She was told of his death and, according to those present, said almost nothing, just looked out the window for a very long time. By 1964, Barbara was 51 years old. Her fortune had been dramatically reduced. Her body was frail, and she was in Tangier, the Moroccan city that had become her sanctuary, the one place in the world where she felt something approaching peace. It was in Tangier that she met Pierre Raymond Don Vin na Champassac. He was an artist. He was younger. He was charming in the effortless way that men who are not burdened by great wealth can sometimes be. Here is the detail that tells you everything about where Barbara Hutton was emotionally by the time of her 7th marriage. She paid to have him granted a royal title. She arranged and funded the legal process by which he became Prince Pierre Don Vin na Champassac, an adopted member of the former royal family of the Kingdom of Champassac in Laos, so that she could marry a prince, so that she could be a princess. She was 51 years old, and she still believed, somewhere in the part of her that had never stopped being 4 years old in a Plaza Hotel suite, that the right title might finally make her feel safe. The wedding was held with Laotian customs gold toe rings for the bride, red painted soles, a 7-tiered cake. The marriage lasted 2 years. He received a settlement of $4 million on departure. 7 husbands. No one who stayed. Let's talk about the money. Because the conventional version of this story says Barbara Hutton simply spent it all, threw it away, burned it up in diamonds and parties and divorces. And that is not the full truth. Yes, she spent lavishly. She owned Winfield House in London's Regent's Park, a 50-room mansion of such grandeur that she eventually donated it to the United States government as the official ambassador's residence. It is still used for that purpose today. The donation alone represented tens of millions of dollars. She built Sumia in Cuernavaca, Mexico, a $2 million Japanese-style palace on 30 acres, with hand-carved wooden beams imported from Japan and gardens designed after Kyoto's imperial estates. She built it for a husband who would leave within 2 years. She collected Russian imperial jewels, old masters' paintings, Ming Dynasty porcelain, and Balenciaga gowns by the wardrobe full. She threw parties in Tangier that lasted for days. She gave cash to strangers on the street. She once tipped a hotel bellboy the equivalent of his monthly salary because he carried her bags without complaining. But here is what the spending narrative leaves out: the systematic extraction by the people around her. Divorce settlements alone, documented and estimated across 7 marriages, cost her between $10 and $15 million. Ruberosa in 53 days. Trubetskoy's millions. Prince Doan's 4 million. These were not gifts. These were the price of exit. Her longtime lawyer, Graham Madison, was later alleged by biographers and associates to have engaged in financial dealings that served his own interests at Barbara's expense. She trusted him completely. He managed her estate for decades. Household staff stole from her. Associates embezzled. People she considered friends submitted inflated invoices for services that were never rendered. She funded her son Lance's Formula One motor racing team for years. Millions poured into a passion project that returned nothing financially, because she loved him and wanted him to have what he wanted. By the 1960s, the $50 million fortune had been reduced to approximately $5 million. And Barbara was still spending not on herself, not really, but on people, on anyone who would show up and stay for a while. Because that was always the transaction she was actually in. Not money for jewels, money for company. Money for the temporary illusion that someone had chosen her. This is the part of the story that nobody tells. The part that makes Barbara Hutton not a cautionary tale, but a tragedy. Biographer C. David Heyman described her psychology with striking precision. He noted that her pattern with men was almost clinical in its consistency. She pursued intensely, became obsessed, did everything in her power to capture their attention, and then, the moment they returned her feelings fully, something in her retreated. She did not want the person who was available. She wanted the person who was just out of reach. The moment someone said, "I love you," without conditions, without agenda, some part of Barbara did not know what to do with it. Because love without conditions was something she had no template for. She had learned, at 4 years old, that the people who were supposed to stay forever left without warning. Her mother vanished. Her father chose not to be there. And what that specific kind of abandonment does to a very young child, is install a belief so deep it becomes invisible. A belief that you are the kind of person people leave. And so she spent her entire life doing the only thing she knew how to do to make people stay. Give them something they needed. Her money, her palaces, her connections, her name. It always worked temporarily, and it always eventually failed. She was not foolish. She was not reckless. She was a woman acting out, over and over. The first loss she ever suffered trying to rewrite an ending that had already been written before she was old enough to read. On July 24, 1972, a small plane carrying Lance Reventlow, Barbara's only child. The boy she had fought 2 brutal custody battles to keep. The young man she had funded and celebrated and loved in her complicated, imperfect way crashed into the mountains near Aspen, Colorado. He was 36 years old. Lance had lived a colorful life of his own. He was a racing driver, a socialite, a man of considerable personal charm who had built a Formula One racing car, the Scarab, that competed in Grand Prix circuits in the late 1950s. He had managed to find something Barbara never quite did, a life of his own, on his own terms. And then he was gone. Barbara was 60. Those who knew her in the weeks and months after Lance's death describe a woman who simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with a visible collapse. She just dimmed. The small remaining fire that had kept her searching it went out. She had spent 60 years looking for someone to love her the way she deserved to be loved. And the one person who had actually, genuinely, unconditionally loved her, because he was her son, was gone. After that, she stopped fighting. She liquidated what remained of her assets. Jewelry went to auction. Properties were sold or abandoned. She began spending the last of her money on strangers, on anyone who would come and sit beside her for an hour. She was buying time, literally, the only currency she had ever really traded in. In her final years, Barbara Hutton lived in a penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills. She could no longer manage the upkeep of a private residence. She required round-the-clock nursing. She had become nearly blind. The bones of her wrists, weakened by decades of anorexia, were so fragile that her nurses handled her carefully, like something that might break. The Beverly Wilshire was and is one of Los Angeles's great luxury hotels, the same building that would later become famous as the setting of Pretty Woman. Barbara lived there at the very top, in a suite that looked out over a city that had never particularly cared about her, except as spectacle. She still had visitors, but fewer and fewer as the 1970s progressed. The people who had revolved around her fortune had drifted away as the fortune had drifted away. Funny how that works. She had no will. She had not prepared one. A will is an acknowledgement that you are going to die, that there is an ending coming. And Barbara had spent her whole life trying to outrun endings. On May 11th, 1979, Barbara Woolworth Hutton died of a heart attack in her penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, California. She was 66 years old. She died bedridden, nearly blind, attended by a nurse. The Washington Post reported her death with a single sentence that, in its compression, managed to contain an entire life, a former jet-setter who had become an ailing recluse. When probate opened on her estate, what remained in cash was approximately $3,500. The debts were larger. Her remaining jewelry and artworks were auctioned off to cover what was owed. Whatever small surplus remained passed to her first cousin, actress Dinah Merrill, as her sole surviving heir. Her funeral was attended by approximately 10 to 12 people. 10 to 12 people. For a woman whose debutante ball had been front-page news across a continent. For a woman who had been photographed at the site of kings, whose every move had been documented by the international press for 4 decades. 10 to 12 people. In a small, private ceremony, she was interred in the Woolworth family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, the same ornate Egyptian revival structure built by her grandfather, the man whose nickel and dime stores had set all of this in motion. The building is magnificent. It was built to outlast the family by centuries. It has. History has told the story of Barbara Hutton as a punchline, as a cautionary tale, as entertainment, and that telling has always been wrong. She was 4 years old when she found her mother's body. Nobody helped her process that. The word trauma did not yet exist in the clinical sense in which we use it now. Children of her class were expected to be resilient, to carry on, to be presented properly, and not make scenes. She was raised in wealth and emotional poverty, simultaneously a combination that is more destabilizing than either alone, because it creates the cruel illusion that you have everything you need while something essential is missing. She was physically abused by her second husband, and nobody called it abuse. She was financially exploited by her lawyers, and nobody called it fraud. She developed a severe eating disorder, and nobody called it a disease. She was addicted to prescription drugs, and nobody called it addiction. They called it Barbara being difficult, Barbara being fragile, Barbara being dramatic. Every man who drained her fortune lived well afterward. Rubirosa used her millions to fund years more of his playboy lifestyle before dying in a sports car crash in 1965. Still glamorous, still celebrated, Reventlow built a comfortable life in Europe. Trubetskoy retired well. Prince Doan spent her $4 million and is barely a footnote in any account of her life. Barbara died with $3,500. She was not foolish. She was unprotected. She was not reckless. She was grieving. She was not throwing money away. She was trying to buy the one thing that was never for sale, the feeling of being safe with another person. The poor little rich girl. They meant it as mockery. But if you follow her life honestly, from a Plaza Hotel suite in 1917 to a Beverly Wilshire penthouse in 1979, what you see is not a girl who was poor despite being rich. You see a girl who was poor in the only way that ultimately matters, and rich in ways the world spent 66 years being too distracted by her diamonds to notice. Barbara Hutton was born with pearls around her future. From the outside, those pearls looked like protection, like a life that was armored and charmed and safe, like nothing could possibly go wrong. But pearls are not armor. They are the product of irritation, a tiny wound inside an oyster, slowly covered over, year after year, until it becomes something the world calls beautiful. What the world does not ask about is the wound underneath. Barbara Hutton spent 66 years being called beautiful by a world that never once asked about the wound underneath. She outlived 6 of her 7 husbands. She outlived her son. She outlived her fortune, her properties, her health, her eyesight, and most of her hope. She kept going when most people would have long since stopped, because whatever else Barbara Hutton was, she was not someone who gave up without a fight. The world got the story wrong. It almost always does. With women like this, women whose lives are too complicated to fit the available categories, too rich to be sympathetic, too suffering to be simply envied, too unconventional to be respectable. History put her in the footnotes. We are going to put her back in the room where she belongs. That is what Behind the Pearls is for. Every week we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single line. We find out what was really inside. If this story moved you, if you believe women like Barbara deserve to have their full truth told, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The next pearl is already waiting, and her story is just as extraordinary. I will see you there.